A cop slaps a black judge during what should have been a routine confrontation. The moment is shocking, brazen, but within minutes, his world flips upside down. The man he thought he could humiliate wields a power far greater than a gavel, and the truth lurking behind this clash is even more explosive than anyone could imagine. Why would a man with everything to lose provoke such chaos? And what forces will bring the cop to his knees begging for mercy? In a battle of authority, justice, and hidden truths, one question remains. Who really holds the power? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 312 seem to absorb the tension like a sponge. Judge Marcus Williams sat tall behind his bench, his dark robes a stark contrast against the polished oak panels behind him. His expression remained steady, though his heart beat with the weight of the moment. In light of the evidence presented, Marcus began, his voice clear and unwavering, this court finds Officer Richard Thompson guilty of excessive force and violation of civil rights. A wave of mutters rippled through the gallery. To his left, rows of uniformed officers shifted in their seats, their faces hardening. To his right, the victim's family clasped hands, tears streaming down their faces. "Order," Marcus commanded, bringing down his gavel. The sound echoed through the now silent courtroom. This court cannot and will not turn a blind eye to misconduct, regardless of the badge behind it. Justice must be blind, but it must also be fair. As Marcus read out the sentence, he noticed several officers standing up and walking out, their boots clicking against the floor in quiet protest. Their message was clear. They saw this verdict as a betrayal. Later that evening, Marcus pulled into his driveway, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow that felt like a welcome embrace. Inside, he found his 17-year-old son Jaden at the kitchen table, homework spread out before him. "I saw the news coverage, Dad," Jaden said, looking up with concern in his eyes. "Are you okay?" Marcus hung his coat and loosened his tie. "Sometimes doing what's right isn't easy, son." He sat down across from Jaden, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder. "But that's exactly why we must do it. Some of the kids at school, their parents are cops." Jaden hesitated. "They're not happy with you." "I know," Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "But we can't let fear or pressure change what we know is right. Being kind doesn't mean being weak, Jaden. Remember that." Across town at the 7th Precinct, Officer Jack Daniels slammed his locker shut, the metal clang making several of his fellow officers jump. The break room was packed with the evening shift, all discussing Judge Williams's verdict. "It's a witch hunt, plain and simple," Jack spat, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Thompson's a good cop, 20 years on the force, and this is how they treat him? This judge, he's got no idea what it's like out there, none of them do." "Daniels," Captain Morrison's stern voice cut through the tension. "My office, now." Inside the captain's office, Morrison leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "You need to cool it, Jack. This kind of talk isn't helping anyone." "With all due respect, sir," Jack's jaw clenched. "We're under attack. The media, these activist judges, they're all out to get us." "That's enough," Morrison's voice hardened. "Your attitude is exactly what we don't need right now. One more outburst like that, and you'll be on desk duty. Understood?" Jack's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he managed a tight "yes, sir," before storming out of the office. As he walked through the precinct hallway, his fellow officers gave him a wide berth, recognizing the storm brewing behind his eyes. In the courthouse's mahogany-paneled conference room, Judge Marcus Williams sat surrounded by 6 eager law interns, their notepads open and pens ready. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished table. "Justice isn't just about following the letter of the law," Marcus explained, his voice gentle but firm. "It's about understanding its spirit, and most importantly, its impact on real people's lives." Sarah, a bright-eyed intern with wire-rimmed glasses, raised her hand. "But Judge Williams, how do you handle cases where public opinion is heavily divided?" Marcus leaned forward, clasping his hands together. That's when we must be most careful to remain objective. The scales of justice don't tip based on popular opinion. Just then, a sharp knock interrupted their session. Linda Chen from the City Tribune stepped in, her press badge catching the light. "Judge Williams, do you have a moment? I'd love your comments on the growing tensions between law enforcement and the judiciary." The interns shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus maintained his composed demeanor. "Ms. Chen, while I appreciate your interest, I believe my recent verdicts speak for themselves. My role is to uphold the law, not to inflame public debate." "But surely you must acknowledge the criticism from police unions," she pressed. "What I acknowledge," Marcus interrupted smoothly, "is that every person in our justice system, from law enforcement to judges, has a sacred duty to serve our community with integrity. That's the only statement I'll make on this matter." Across town, Officer Jack Daniels cruised through his beat in a patrol car, his partner Officer Rodriguez watching him with growing concern. Jack had already written his 5th citation of the morning, this time for a broken taillight. "That's the 3rd minor violation in an hour, Jack," Rodriguez said carefully. "Maybe we should focus on more pressing matters?" Jack's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. These people need to learn respect for law and order. Everyone's so quick to cry police brutality these days, but nobody talks about the lack of basic compliance. "Come on, man," Rodriguez sighed. "You're letting this get to you. That Thompson verdict—" "That verdict was bull," Jack snapped, pulling the car over abruptly. "First Thompson, now everyone's watching us like hawks. Even my kid's teacher gave me the side eye at last week's parent conference. Like I'm some kind of monster for wearing this badge." The afternoon sun was setting when both men's paths crossed at May's Diner, a local favorite known for its home-style cooking. Marcus sat at his usual corner booth, where Sally, the elderly waitress, had already brought him his standard order of black coffee and wheat toast. "Judge Williams, how's that boy of yours?" Sally asked warmly, topping off his coffee. "Jaden's doing well, Sally, thank you for asking," Marcus replied with a genuine smile. The bell above the door chimed as Jack entered, still in uniform, his face like a thundercloud. He took a seat at the counter, deliberately avoiding looking at the corner booth, though he'd recognized the judge immediately. "The usual, Jack?" Sally called out. "Yeah," he muttered, then added under his breath, "At least someone in this town still treats us with respect." Marcus and Jack's eyes met briefly in the reflection of the diner's large front window. The judge nodded politely, but Jack quickly looked away, jabbing his fork into the paper napkin dispenser with unnecessary force. Sally glanced between them, sensing the tension, and busied herself with Jack's order. The diner's usual warm atmosphere seemed to cool several degrees, though neither man made any move to acknowledge the other further. The peaceful afternoon at May's Diner shattered when Officer Jack Daniels burst through the door, roughly pushing a young black man in front of him. The man, Ryan Jefferson, stumbled but kept his dignity, his hands raised in a clear display of compliance. "I told you, officer, I was just waiting for my order," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I have the receipt right here." Jack's face reddened as he tightened his grip on Ryan's arm. "Yeah? Then why did you try to leave when I approached you?" "I didn't. I was just stepping aside to let another customer pass," Ryan explained, wincing at Jack's grip. Marcus Williams set down his coffee cup, observing the scene with growing concern. The other diners had fallen silent, several pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. Sally, the waitress, wrung her hands nervously behind the counter. "He's telling the truth, officer," Sally called out. "Ryan's one of our regulars. His order's almost ready." Jack ignored her, pushing Ryan against the counter. "ID, now." Marcus stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. "Officer, if I may intervene?" "Stay out of this," Jack snapped, not bothering to look at Marcus. "I believe the young man has explained himself and the staff has verified his story," Marcus continued, his voice firm but peaceful. "There seems to be no cause for this level of force." Jack finally turned to face Marcus, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm simply suggesting that we can resolve this situation without—" The crack of Jack's palm against Marcus's cheek echoed through the diner. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by the distinctive sounds of phone cameras clicking. Marcus stumbled back a step but remained upright, touching his reddening cheek with dignified composure. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "That's Judge Williams." The color drained from Jack's face as he realized what he'd done, and to whom. Ryan took advantage of the officer's shocked state to step away from his grip, moving to stand near Sally at the counter. Marcus straightened his tie, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Jack's crumbling expression. "Officer Daniels, I believe we'll be discussing this incident through proper channels." Later that evening, Marcus sat in his living room with his wife Camille, watching the video of the incident playing on the local news. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support and outrage. "The police chief called again," Camille said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "They want to know if you'll be pressing charges." Marcus sighed deeply, rubbing his temple. Part of me wants to let it go. Pressing charges would only deepen the divide between law enforcement and the judiciary. "And the other part?" Camille asked, knowing her husband's thoughtful nature. "The other part knows that letting this slide would send the wrong message. Not just about police conduct, but about the very principles of justice we're trying to uphold." He picked up his phone, showing Camille the latest social media updates. The video's gone viral. People are already using it as an example of police overreach. "What would you tell Jaden to do in this situation?" Camille asked gently. Marcus leaned back, considering her question. "I'd tell him to stand up for what's right, but to do it in a way that creates positive change rather than more division." The next morning, Marcus stood at his living room window, watching the growing crowd of reporters and news vans filling his normally quiet suburban street. Camera flashes lit up the early morning shadows like lightning, and reporters clutched their microphones ready to pounce on anyone who emerged from the house. "They've been there since 5 a.m., Camille said, handing him a cup of coffee. Her usual cheerful expression was clouded with worry. "Channel 4 called 3 times already." Marcus took a sip of coffee, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. "I've asked Judge Thompson to take my cases today. The courthouse doesn't need this circus." Across town, Jack Daniels sat in Captain Reynolds' office, his badge and gun already surrendered to internal affairs. The morning news played silently on a wall-mounted TV, showing the viral video of him slapping Judge Williams on repeat. "What were you thinking, Daniels?" Captain Reynolds paced behind his desk. "A respected judge? In broad daylight? With witnesses recording everything?" Jack stared at his hands, his face ashen. "I lost control, sir. I felt like everyone was against us, and when he tried to tell me how to handle the situation..." "He was trying to prevent exactly this." Reynolds slammed his palm on the desk. "You're suspended pending investigation. The mayor's office is breathing down our necks. The police union rep will be here this afternoon." When Jack arrived home, he found Emily sitting at their kitchen table, her face streaked with tears. Their 2 young children's drawings hung on the refrigerator behind her, happy stick figures of their daddy in his police uniform. "How could you?" Emily's voice trembled. "Everything we've worked for, Jack. The house, the kids' college fund. What if they fire you?" No." She stood up suddenly. "Don't make excuses. I saw the video. That man was trying to help and you..." She shook her head. "The Jack I married would never have done that. What's happened to you?" Back at the Williams residence, Jaden lingered in the hallway outside his parents' bedroom, listening to their conversation through the partially open door. "The police chief says Officer Daniels has been suspended," Marcus was saying. "They're requesting a meeting to discuss how to handle this situation." "And what are you going to do?" Camille asked. "I'm considering all options. This isn't just about me anymore." Jaden couldn't stay quiet any longer. He pushed the door open. "Dad, why aren't you fighting back? He attacked you. In public." Marcus turned to his son, seeing the fire of youth and righteous anger in his eyes. "Come here, son." He patted the bed beside him. Jaden sat down, his teenage frame practically vibrating with frustration. "Everyone at school saw the video. They're saying you should sue him, get him fired, make an example of him." "And what would that accomplish?" Marcus asked gently. Justice, Jaden exclaimed. He needs to face consequences. Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder. There's a difference between consequences and revenge, Jaden. Officer Daniels' actions came from a place of fear and anger. If we respond with more anger, we're just feeding the same cycle that led to this incident. So he just gets away with it? Jaden's voice cracked with emotion. No, Marcus replied firmly. But true justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. Sometimes the hardest path, the path of reconciliation, is the one that creates real change. Jaden shook his head, unconvinced. I don't understand, Dad. How can you be so calm about this? Because someone has to be, Marcus answered, pulling his son close. Someone has to show there's another way forward. Mayor Patricia Chen's black SUV pulled up to the Williams residence, cutting through the sea of reporters like a ship through rough waters. The reporters surged forward, but her security detail kept them at bay as she made her way to the front door. Inside Marcus's study, sunlight filtered through heavy curtains as he sat across from the mayor. Her usual political smile was replaced with a grave expression. Marcus, we need you to press charges, Mayor Chen said, leaning forward in her leather chair. The public is demanding accountability. This incident has become bigger than just you and Officer Daniels. Marcus rubbed his temples. I understand the political pressure, Patricia, but my goal has always been justice, not vengeance. This isn't about vengeance, she countered. It's about maintaining public trust in our institutions. If we let this slide, what message does that send? Camille, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped in with fresh coffee. She has a point, Marcus. Sometimes doing nothing causes more harm than taking action. After an hour of discussion, Marcus finally nodded. All right, I'll press charges, but I want it noted that my intention is to address the systemic issues, not to destroy Officer Daniels. Across town, Jack Daniels sat in a downtown law office, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes that somehow made him look smaller. His attorney, Dennis Goldberg, reviewed the viral video for the third time on his laptop. This is serious, Jack, Dennis said, closing the laptop. Assaulting a judge? The DA's office will throw everything they have at you. Jack shifted in his chair, his face flushed. It was just a heat-of-the-moment thing. Everyone's acting like I committed murder or something. Dennis leaned back, studying his client. Let me be clear. You're facing assault charges against a public official, potential civil rights violations, and the end of your career. This isn't something we can minimize. But no buts, Dennis cut him off. Your badge is already suspended and the union can only do so much. We need to start thinking about a plea strategy. Meanwhile, at Lincoln High School, Jaden Williams sat in his advanced biology class, trying to ignore the whispers and stares from his classmates. Mrs. Peterson was assigning partners for the semester's major project. Jaden Williams and Maggie Daniels, Mrs. Peterson announced. You'll be working on cellular regeneration. Maggie, a quiet girl with auburn hair and tired eyes, moved to sit next to Jaden. Neither spoke at first, both aware of the tension in the air. So, Maggie finally said, opening her textbook. Cellular regeneration. Pretty interesting stuff. Jaden nodded, grateful for her normal tone. Yeah, I was thinking we could focus on salamanders and their ability to regrow limbs. As they worked, their initial awkwardness slowly melted away. During a break, Maggie suddenly spoke up. It sucks, doesn't it? When your dad's all over the news? Jaden looked up, surprised. Yeah, it really does. Everyone acts like they know everything about it, but they don't understand. Tell me about it, Maggie sighed. My dad's not usually like that, you know? He's actually really nice at home. But lately he's been so angry and stressed. My dad's the opposite, Jaden admitted. He's so calm about everything, it almost makes me more frustrated. I mean, how can he be so peaceful when everyone's attacking him? They shared a look of understanding, two teenagers caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts. Neither mentioned their father's names or the incident, but the unspoken connection between them grew stronger as they worked on their project. Maybe we could meet at the library after school, Maggie suggested. It might be easier to work there, away from everything. Jaden smiled, feeling lighter than he had in days. Yeah, that would be great. Marcus stared at the crumpled paper in his hands, his jaw tightening as he read the threatening words scrawled in angry red ink. It was the third such letter this week. Beside him, Ted Morrison from Elite Protection Services reviewed the security footage from their newly installed cameras. We'll add another guard for night shifts, Ted said, making notes on his tablet. And I strongly recommend changing your regular routes to work. Camille paced the kitchen, her usual calm demeanor strained. This is getting out of hand, Marcus. Yesterday, someone followed me from the grocery store. What if they start targeting Jaden? Marcus set the letter down and pulled his wife into a gentle embrace. I hear you, love. We'll take every precaution necessary. He kissed her forehead, though his own worry showed in the deep lines around his eyes. The trial date is set for next month. We just need to stay vigilant until then. Vigilant? Camille pulled back, her voice rising. Our son can't even go to basketball practice without security. This isn't the life I want for our family. Across town at the Rusty Nail, Jack Daniels slouched over his fourth whiskey. The bar's afternoon shadows matched his dark mood as he stared at his phone, scrolling through news articles about himself. His badge and gun were gone, locked away in some precinct drawer while pencil pushers decided his fate. Officer Mike Sullivan, his former partner, slid onto the neighboring bar stool. Come on, Jack. It's only 3 in the afternoon. Let's get you home. Don't start, Jack growled, waving for another drink. Emily's already giving me enough grief. Because she cares about you, man. We all do. This isn't the way to handle things. Jack's fist slammed onto the bar, making glasses rattle. Handle things? My career is over. 20 years down the drain because some bleeding heart judge wanted to make an example of me. You hit him, Jack, Mike said quietly. There's no spinning that. Jack spun toward his friend, face flushed with anger and alcohol. Get out of here with that holier-than-thou garbage. You're just like all the others, ready to throw me under the bus to save your own skin. Mike stood slowly, sadness etched on his weathered face. Call me when you're ready to stop feeling sorry for yourself. Meanwhile, at the Williams residence, Jaden and Maggie sat at the dining room table surrounded by biology textbooks and notebooks. Their cellular regeneration project had brought them together several times over the past week, and their easy friendship had grown despite the tension between their families. Camille froze in the doorway when she first saw Maggie, recognition hitting her like a physical force. The girl had her father's eyes, though hers held a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the angry man from the diner video. Mom, Jaden said, noticing her hesitation. This is Maggie. We're working on our biology project. Maggie stood awkwardly, tucking her hair behind her ear. Thank you for letting me study here, Mrs. Williams. The library's been pretty crowded lately. Camille's maternal instincts warred with her protective ones as she observed the nervous teenager. After a moment, she managed a warm smile. Would you two like some snacks while you work? That would be great, Mom, Jaden said, relief evident in his voice. As Camille prepared a plate of cookies and fruit, she watched the two teenagers through the kitchen doorway. They worked well together, heads bent over their books, occasionally sharing quiet laughs. Despite everything happening around them, they'd found a way to bridge the divide that their fathers couldn't. The community center buzzed with tension as Marcus Williams took the podium. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the packed room, where concerned citizens filled every folding chair. Security guards stood at strategic points, their presence a stark reminder of the volatility surrounding the case. I understand the emotions this situation has stirred, Marcus began, his voice steady and measured. But we must remember that justice serves everyone equally. A man in a police union jacket shot up from his seat. What about justice for our officers? You've been gunning for us since day one. Murmurs of agreement rippled through one side of the room while angry protests rose from the other. Outside, the muffled chants of demonstrators filtered through the windows. Marcus raised his hands, attempting to calm the crowd. Every case that comes before me is judged on its own merits. Personal bias has no place in our justice system. That's bull, another voice shouted. You're making an example of Jack because it fits your agenda. The meeting dissolved into chaos as supporters from both sides began shouting over each other. Security moved closer to Marcus as water bottles and paper balls flew through the air. Through it all, Marcus maintained his composure, though his eyes reflected deep sadness at the scene unfolding before him. Across town, Jack Daniels stood at the front entrance of Roosevelt High School, arguing with the security guard. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes were bloodshot from another sleepless night. "Look, I just want to have lunch with my daughter," Jack pleaded, his voice rough. "I'm her father." The guard, a young man named Kevin, shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're on the restricted list. School policy." Inside the cafeteria, Maggie watched through the window, her face burning with embarrassment as other students whispered and pointed. Her best friend Sarah touched her arm gently. "Maybe you should go talk to him," Sarah suggested. Maggie shook her head, gathering her books. "I can't deal with this right now." She hurried from the cafeteria, leaving her half-eaten lunch behind. Jack caught a glimpse of his daughter's retreating form through the glass doors. "Maggie," he called out, but she didn't turn around. The security guard stepped closer, hand resting on his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Jack's shoulders slumped in defeat as he watched Maggie disappear down the hallway. The walk back to his car felt longer than ever. Later that evening, Camille Williams stood in her kitchen, watching through the window as Jaden and Maggie sat on the back porch working on their project. The sight filled her with unease. "Jaden," she called, "can we talk for a moment?" When Jaden came inside, Camille kept her voice low. "I'm worried about how much time you're spending with Maggie Daniels. Given everything that's happening—" "Mom, stop," Jaden interrupted. "Maggie's not her dad. She's smart and kind, and she feels terrible about what happened. I know she seems nice, sweetheart, but her father attacked your father. These situations are complicated." "No, they're not," Jaden insisted, his voice rising. "You're the ones making it complicated. Maggie's my friend, and she shouldn't be punished for something she didn't do." "I'm trying to protect you," Camille said, reaching for his arm. Jaden pulled away. "I don't need protection from Maggie. Maybe if more people actually talked to each other instead of picking sides, things wouldn't be so messed up." He stormed back outside, leaving Camille standing alone in the kitchen. Through the window, she watched as he rejoined Maggie, their heads bent together over their textbooks. Two teenagers trying to find their way in a world increasingly divided by their parents' conflicts. In a dimly lit conference room, Dennis Goldberg spread several documents across the mahogany table. Jack Daniels sat slumped in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Look, Jack," Dennis said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The video evidence is damaging. A public apology could help minimize the fallout." Jack's jaw clenched. "I'm not apologizing to that man. He was interfering with police business. He's a respected judge, Jack. The footage clearly shows you were out of line." Dennis leaned forward, his voice softening. "Think about your career, your family. A heartfelt apology could make the difference between keeping your badge and losing everything." "Everything?" Jack scoffed, but his voice wavered. "I've already lost everything. My daughter won't even look at me. Emily's talking about separation." His fist thumped against the table. "And now you want me to grovel?" "I want you to take responsibility," Dennis corrected firmly. "It's your best chance." Jack stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I did my job for 20 years. Nobody gets to tell me I was wrong." Meanwhile, in the school library, Jaden and Maggie sat at a quiet corner table, surrounded by books and notebooks. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches across their work. "My dad always says that doing the right thing isn't about being popular," Jaden explained, sketching out their project outline. "He tells me that true justice means standing up for what's fair, even when it's hard." Maggie traced her pencil absently across her notebook. "What was he like that day? At the diner?" Jaden paused, choosing his words carefully. "He was calm, even after, He told me later that anger just makes more anger, but kindness can break the cycle." "My dad used to be different," Maggie said quietly. "He used to take me fishing, tell jokes, but lately he's so angry all the time. It's like he can't see past his own hurt anymore." "People can change," Jaden offered gently. That's what my dad believes. Tears welled in Maggie's eyes. I wish my dad could see that. Across town, Marcus stood in his study holding a crisp white envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he read the anonymous threat again. Drop the charges or your family pays the price. Camille entered the room, noting his expression. Another one? Marcus nodded, passing her the letter. Outside their window, a security guard patrolled the perimeter of their property. Marcus, this is getting serious, Camille said, her voice tight with worry. Maybe we should consider dropping the charges. If I back down now, what message does that send? Marcus sank into his leather chair. That threats and intimidation can override justice? What about our safety, Jaden's safety? Camille pressed her hands against his desk. I believe in what you stand for, but I'm scared. Marcus reached for her hand. So am I. But if we let fear dictate our actions, nothing will ever change. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, himself, Camille, and Jaden at the beach last summer, all smiling. Sometimes standing up for what's right means facing our fears. But at what cost? Camille whispered, squeezing his hand. Through the window, they watched another security guard circle the house, his radio crackling with updates. The setting sun cast long shadows across their yard, a stark reminder of the growing darkness surrounding their family. The clock struck midnight as Jack Daniels stumbled through his living room, an empty whiskey bottle dangling from his fingers. Emily sat on the couch, her face tight with worry and exhaustion. You're all against me, Jack slurred, pointing an unsteady finger at his wife. Even my own family won't stand by me. Emily took a deep breath. Jack, please. You need help. This isn't about taking sides. Like hell it isn't. The bottle crashed against the wall, making Emily flinch. That judge thinks he can ruin my life, and you're letting him. Upstairs, Maggie huddled in her bedroom, pressing her hands against her ears, but her father's voice carried through the walls, each angry word making her shoulders shake. I've supported you for 20 years, Emily said, rising from the couch, but I won't watch you destroy yourself and drag us down with you. So now you're leaving too? Jack's face twisted with rage. Just like everyone else? Dad, please stop. Maggie appeared at the bottom of the stairs, tears streaming down her face. Jack turned, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. Go back to your room, Maggie. This doesn't concern you. Everything you do concerns us, Emily said firmly. She walked to the stairs and took Maggie's hand. Come on, honey. Pack a bag. We're going to Aunt Sarah's for a while. Emily, don't you dare. Jack started forward but stumbled against the coffee table. When you're ready to get help, call us, Emily said, her voice breaking. She guided Maggie upstairs, leaving Jack alone with his anger and shame. Across town, Marcus Williams sat in a modest apartment, listening to Ryan Jefferson describe the aftermath of the diner incident. The young man's hands fidgeted with a coffee cup as he spoke. It's gotten worse since that day, Ryan explained. Like they're trying to prove a point. I get stopped almost daily now. They follow me home sometimes. Marcus leaned forward, his expression grave. Have you filed any complaints? Ryan laughed bitterly. What's the point? They protect their own. That's what makes what you're doing so important, Judge Williams. You're the first person with power who's actually stood up to them. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper on his shoulders. The system needs to change, Ryan. But change comes at a cost. I know about the threats, Ryan said quietly. My mom saw the news. You don't have to keep fighting this battle. Back at the Williams home, Jaden pressed his ear against his father's study door, listening to his parents' conversation. These threats are escalating, Camille was saying. Maybe we should consider. We can't give up now, Jaden burst into the room, startling both his parents. Dad, you always taught me that standing up for what's right matters most when it's hardest. Marcus exchanged a look with Camille. Son, it's not that simple. Your safety is exactly why you have to keep going, Jaden insisted. If we let them scare us into backing down, nothing will ever change. You taught me that. Marcus studied his son's determined face, seeing his own principles reflected back at him. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, Jaden said, moving to hug his father. We can't let fear and hate win, Dad. We just can't. Camille wiped away a tear, watching her husband and son embrace. The security lights cast long shadows through the study windows, but inside, their resolve burned brighter than ever. The doorbell rang on a quiet Saturday afternoon at the Williams residence. Camille opened the door to find Maggie Daniels standing nervously on their front porch, her backpack clutched tightly against her chest. Is Jaden home? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Camille's expression tightened. This isn't a good time. Mom, it's okay, Jaden appeared behind her. We have that history project due Monday. Camille hesitated, then stepped aside. As Maggie entered, her eyes wandered to the family photos lining the hallway. She paused at one showing Marcus in his judge's robes. Your dad looks so dignified, Maggie said softly. My teacher said he's one of the most respected judges in the city. She said he always fights for what's right, even when it's hard. Something in Maggie's sincere admiration made Camille's expression soften. Would you like some cookies? I just baked them. In his study, Marcus was reviewing case files when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Judge Williams speaking. Judge, it's Jack Daniels. The voice on the other end sounded strained. Marcus sat up straighter, his grip tightening on the phone. Officer Daniels. Look, I've been thinking, Jack's words slurred slightly. Maybe I shouldn't have, at the diner. But you were getting in my face, acting all high and mighty. I was preventing you from violating a citizen's rights, Marcus interrupted firmly. See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Jack's voice rose. You judges think you know everything about our job. If you hadn't been so condescending with your attitude. Officer Daniels, until you're ready to take full responsibility for your actions, we have nothing to discuss. Marcus ended the call, his hand shaking slightly as he set down the phone. Across town at Sarah Miller's house, Emily Daniels sat at her sister's kitchen table, cradling a cup of cold coffee. Maggie had just returned from the Williams house and now sat beside her mother, worry etched on her young face. I can't go back, Maggie, Emily said quietly. Your father, he needs help, but he won't admit it. I'm thinking about filing for divorce. Mom, no. Maggie grabbed her mother's hand. Dad's just going through a rough time. Remember when he taught me to ride a bike? Or when he stayed up all night making my science fair project after I got sick? That was the old Jack. Emily wiped away a tear. This anger, this bitterness, it's consuming him. Maybe if we just give him more time, Maggie pleaded. He could change, like in those movies where the bad guy realizes he was wrong and becomes good again. Emily pulled her daughter close. Life isn't always like the movies, sweetheart. Sometimes people have to hit rock bottom before they can change. But what if rock bottom means losing us? Maggie's voice cracked. I hate what he did, but he's still my dad. I don't want to lose him. Sarah appeared in the doorway, watching her sister comfort her niece. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking time as mother and daughter held each other, both caught between love and disappointment, hope and reality. The parking garage was dimly lit as Marcus Williams walked toward his car after a long day at the courthouse. His footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, mixing with the distant sound of traffic. The private security guard had stepped away briefly to check another level. Suddenly, a dark figure emerged from behind a concrete pillar. Before Marcus could react, the masked attacker struck him hard across the back with what felt like a metal pipe. Marcus crashed to the ground, his briefcase skidding across the floor. Pain exploded through his body as the attacker delivered another blow. Through the haze of pain, Marcus managed to roll away from a third strike. The security cameras whirred above, their red lights blinking steadily. The attacker seemed to notice them too and fled, leaving Marcus bleeding on the cold concrete. Hours later, Jack Daniels sat in a stark interrogation room, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, he spat at the investigators. I had nothing to do with it. Where were you between 5:30 and 6 p.m. today? Detective Rodriguez asked calmly. At home. Emily can vouch for me. Jack's voice cracked slightly. But when Emily Daniels was questioned separately, her hands trembled. I'm not sure. Jack went out for a while. He said he needed air. Her eyes filled with tears. I want to believe he didn't do this, but lately, I don't know who he is anymore. Jack's face fell when he learned of Emily's statement. As officers led him to a holding cell for further questioning, the weight of his isolation pressed down on him like a physical thing. At Metro General Hospital, Jaden Williams sat beside his father's bed, holding his hand. Marcus's face was bruised, and his ribs were wrapped tightly. Dad, maybe you should drop the case, Jaden whispered. It's not worth losing you. Marcus squeezed his son's hand. If we let fear stop us from doing what's right, nothing will ever change. Jaden straightened in his chair. Then we'll face it together. I'll help Mom set up better security at home, and I'll start driving you to work. Marcus studied his son's face, seeing not the child he'd raised, but the man he was becoming. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, Jaden replied, his voice steady despite his tears. You always taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. In the precinct's conference room, Marcus Williams leaned forward in his chair, studying the security footage from the parking garage attack. Detective Rodriguez pointed to several freeze frames showing the attacker's distinctive movements. Notice the stance, the way he holds the weapon, Rodriguez said. That's standard police combat training. Marcus's stomach tightened. You're saying this wasn't just a random attack? The timing, the location, the technique. This was someone with inside knowledge. Rodriguez spread out several documents. We've been tracking similar incidents across 3 precincts, all targeting officers or officials who spoke out against misconduct. Meanwhile, Jack Daniels sat alone in his living room, surrounded by empty bottles. The TV news played footage of Marcus speaking at the community forum. For the first time, Jack really listened to the words instead of reacting with anger. We must examine our own hearts, Marcus was saying, and ask if we're truly serving and protecting everyone equally. Jack's eyes drifted to a photo on the wall, himself as a rookie officer, proud and idealistic. When had that changed? He thought about Ryan Jefferson at the diner, about other encounters he'd witnessed over the years. The justifications he'd always accepted suddenly felt hollow. His phone buzzed with a message from a fellow officer. Stay strong, brother. We take care of our own. The words that once brought comfort now made him uneasy. Across town, Jaden Williams sat at the Daniels dining room table. Emily had prepared lasagna, and the atmosphere was surprisingly warm despite the circumstances. Your father is an extraordinary man, Emily said, passing Jaden the garlic bread. Standing up for what's right, even after everything that's happened. Maggie smiled at Jaden. Dad used to tell me stories about good cops making a difference. Maybe that's why this whole thing hurts so much. The front door suddenly opened. Jack Daniels stepped in, stopping short at the sight of Jaden. The room fell silent. What's he doing here? Jack's voice was quiet but tense. Jack, please, Emily started, but Jack was already backing away. I can't be in my own house now? His eyes locked with Jaden's. This is still my home. Maggie stood up. Dad, Jaden's my friend. We're just having dinner. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Emily touched Jaden's shoulder. Maybe we should save dessert for another time. Detective Clara Monroe spread photographs across Marcus's desk, her expression grave. The attacker knew exactly when you'd be alone in that garage, Judge Williams. They even disabled the specific security camera covering your usual parking spot. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his shoulder still aching from the attack. Someone's been watching me. Not just watching, they had access to your security protocols. Clara tapped one of the photos. This level of precision? It's someone with a badge. Across town, Jack Daniels opened his front door to find Paul Simmons, his former partner, standing there with a tight smile. We need to talk, Jack. Simmons stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Things are getting complicated with this Williams situation. Jack's stomach churned. What do you mean? Just remember who your real friends are. Simmons's voice dropped lower. Some officers are concerned you might start talking about other incidents. That wouldn't be good for anyone. The threat in Simmons's words was clear. Jack watched his old partner leave, his mind racing with memories of times they'd looked the other way, of reports they'd modified. Later that evening, Marcus sat with Camille in their kitchen, his hands wrapped around a cooling mug of tea. They're getting closer to identifying who's behind this, Marcus said quietly. But Clara thinks it goes deeper than just the attack on me. Camille's hands trembled as she reached for his. Marcus, please. We have Jayden to think about. What if next time they don't miss? If I back down now, nothing changes. Marcus squeezed her hands. How many other families live in fear because no one stands up to this corruption? And what about our family? Tears welled in Camille's eyes. I can't lose you, Marcus. Marcus pulled her close, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. I know you're scared. I am too. But if we let fear win, we're teaching Jayden that injustice is stronger than courage. Marcus's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit storage facility as he followed Detective Clara Monroe. The anonymous tip had come in that morning, a hastily scribbled note with a unit number and a warning about police corruption. Here it is, Clara whispered, stopping at Unit 247. She unlocked the padlock with the key provided in the tip. The metal door creaked open, revealing stacks of boxes and file folders. Marcus pulled out his phone for light while Clara began sorting through the papers. Judge Williams, look at this. Clara's voice trembled as she held up a folder. Inside were detailed records of payoffs, altered police reports, and surveillance photos, including several of Marcus himself. Officer Paul Simmons's name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Across town at the precinct, Jack Daniels was heading to the break room when he heard familiar voices around the corner. Williams was supposed to back off after that warning in the garage, Simmons was saying in a low voice. Maybe next time we shouldn't miss. Jack froze, his coffee cup nearly slipping from his hand. His former partner had orchestrated the attack on Judge Williams. The realization made him sick to his stomach. Meanwhile, at the local library, Jayden and Maggie sat working on their homework together when Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from her father. Dad's really upset about something at work, Maggie whispered, showing Jayden the message. He keeps talking about Officer Simmons and your dad. Jayden's eyes widened. Wait, Simmons? I heard my dad mention that name to Detective Monroe this morning. They found something about him in some storage unit. Maggie bit her lip. My dad's been acting weird ever since Officer Simmons visited our house. I think he knows something bad about what happened to your father. We have to tell them, Jayden said firmly. My dad needs to know about this connection. Maggie nodded slowly. You're right. And I need to talk to my dad. He's been struggling with something. Maybe this is it. He needs to do the right thing. Even if it means getting other officers in trouble? Jayden asked gently. Especially then, Maggie replied, her voice stronger than she felt. That's what your dad's been fighting for, right? Justice has to matter more than protecting bad people. Marcus stood at the podium outside the courthouse, his hand steady despite the tension in the air. Camera flashes sparked like lightning as he cleared his throat. Detective Clara Monroe stood quietly to his right, a folder of evidence clutched to her chest. Today, I stand before you with evidence of systematic corruption within our police department, Marcus announced, his voice firm and clear. The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and angry shouts. We have uncovered documentation of altered police reports, illegal surveillance, and organized intimidation tactics, he continued. Signs waved in the air, some supporting him, others calling him a traitor. Suddenly, a bottle flew through the air. Security rushed to protect Marcus as the crowd surged forward. This is exactly why we need change, Marcus called out over the chaos. When truth threatens power, violence follows. Later that evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with an unknown number. The text was brief, but clear. Storage unit was just the beginning. Watch your back. They're planning something at your house tonight. Marcus showed the message to Detective Monroe. Could be Jack Daniels, she suggested, studying the text. He's been acting strange at the precinct lately. Whether it's him or not, we need to take it seriously, Marcus replied, already calling to increase his security detail. Across town, Maggie stood in her family's kitchen, watching her father pace. Jack's face was drawn, his uniform hanging untouched on a chair. "Dad, please," Maggie pleaded, her voice breaking. "I know you know something about what Officer Simmons did. Judge Williams is trying to fix things, and he needs help." Jack stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "It's not that simple, Maggie." "Yes, it is." Tears welled in her eyes. "You taught me to always tell the truth. What changed?" Jack sank into a chair, running his hands over his face. If I tell what I know," his voice cracked. "People I worked with for years could go to prison." "And if you don't?" Maggie challenged. "What happens to Judge Williams, to his family, to everything that's right?" Jack looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her eyes. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. The weight of years of silence pressed down on him, threatening to crush him completely. The dimly lit bar was nearly empty when Jack slipped into a booth across from Paul Simmons. His phone, carefully hidden in his jacket pocket, recorded every word as Simmons nursed his third whiskey. "You're looking rough, Jack," Simmons sneered. "Conscience keeping you up at night?" Jack's hands trembled slightly under the table. "I know what you did to Judge Williams, Paul. The attack in the parking garage, that was you." Simmons's face hardened. "Careful now, Jack. You're walking a dangerous line." "Someone could have died," Jack pressed, his voice low but firm. Simmons leaned forward, his breath heavy with alcohol. "Yeah, I arranged it. Taught that self-righteous judge a lesson. And if you breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll get worse than he did. Remember, I know where your daughter goes to school." Jack felt sick but kept his face neutral. The recording would be damning evidence if he dared to use it. Outside the courthouse, Marcus was ambushed by a swarm of reporters. Camera lights blinded him as microphones thrust into his face. "Judge Williams, how do you respond to these photos showing you instigating the diner incident with Officer Daniels?" A reporter shoved doctored photographs in his face. Marcus's stomach dropped as he examined the clearly manipulated images showing him apparently shoving Jack first. "These photos are fabricated," he stated firmly, but the damage was already spreading as reporters fired off more accusations. "Sources claim you have a history of provoking law enforcement. Care to comment?" Marcus maintained his composure, though his heart raced. "These are desperate attempts to discredit the truth. The evidence of corruption we've uncovered speaks for itself." Emily found Jack sitting in their darkened living room, the glow of his phone illuminating his troubled face. She heard Simmons's threatening voice playing softly from the recording. "You have to turn this in," she said quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jack's voice cracked. "If I do, everything falls apart. My career, our safety." "Jack," Emily interrupted gently. "Everything's already falling apart. But it's not too late to help make it right." She sat beside him, taking his hand. "The man I married wouldn't let someone threaten an innocent family, wouldn't stay silent about corruption." Tears welled in Jack's eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'm scared, Emily." "I know," she whispered. "But doing the right thing is always scary. That's what makes it brave." The early morning sun cast long shadows as Detective Clara Monroe and her team surrounded Officer Paul Simmons's modest suburban home. Marcus Williams stood back, watching as officers breached the door with the fresh warrant in hand. "Clear," voices called out from inside. Clara emerged minutes later holding a laptop and several files. "Judge Williams, you need to see this." Her face was grim as she showed him a folder filled with surveillance photos. Not just of him, but of other judges and officials who had challenged police misconduct. "He's been planning this for months," Clara said, leafing through the evidence. "Bank statements show payments to known criminals. This goes deeper than we thought." Later that afternoon, Jack Daniels sat across from Marcus in the judge's chambers, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his conscience. "I was wrong," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just about the slap. About everything. His hands twisted in his lap. I let my pride blind me. Watched good cops turn bad and said nothing because I thought speaking up made me a traitor. Marcus remained silent, his face unreadable. I saw things that weren't there, Jack continued, tears welling in his eyes. Made assumptions about people based on nothing but my own fears and prejudices. It took almost losing my family to see how wrong I was. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Why tell me this now? Because someone needs to start breaking down these walls, Jack replied. And I need to take responsibility for my part in building them. At school, Maggie Daniels stood on the steps during lunch break, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Beside her, Jaden Williams held up a sign reading, "Unity starts with us." Our parents' generation is torn apart by fear and mistrust, Maggie spoke into the megaphone. But we can choose a different path. Students from all backgrounds gathered around, many holding their own handmade signs. Some read, "Justice for all" and "Break the cycle." My father made mistakes, Maggie continued, her voice strong despite its trembling. Judge Williams showed us that justice and compassion can go hand in hand. We don't have to repeat the past. Jaden stepped forward to speak. Change starts here with us. We can build bridges instead of walls. The crowd of students cheered, their voices echoing across the schoolyard. Teachers watched from windows, some wiping away tears at the sight of their students coming together instead of pulling apart. In the mayor's wood-paneled office, Marcus Williams spread out the evidence across the polished desk. Photos, bank statements, and surveillance logs created a damning picture of corruption. Mayor Thompson's face grew increasingly pale as he examined each document. This goes beyond Simmons, Marcus explained, his voice steady. These payments suggest a network within the department protecting corrupt officers. The mayor dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. This could tear the city apart, Marcus. It already is torn apart, Marcus replied firmly. The question is whether we'll have the courage to heal it. Mayor Thompson nodded slowly, though Marcus noticed the political calculation behind his eyes. I'll authorize the investigation, the mayor said finally. But we need to handle this. Delicately. The Internal Review Board sat in stern silence as Jack Daniels approached the podium. His hands shook slightly as he placed his phone on the desk and pressed play. Simmons's voice filled the room, clear and damning. If you breathe a word about the judge, you'll regret it, Simmons's recorded voice threatened. We take care of our own. The board members exchanged shocked glances as Jack detailed years of witnessed misconduct and cover-ups. When he finished, the chairman immediately called for Simmons's arrest. Outside the hearing room, Detective Clara Monroe personally handcuffed Simmons, who glared at Jack with undisguised hatred as he was led away. Later that evening, Jack found Marcus alone in his chambers. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows as Jack struggled to find the right words. I've spent weeks trying to figure out how to say this, Jack began, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. Marcus remained silent, watching Jack intently. I let my badge become a shield for my prejudices, Jack continued, tears forming in his eyes. I became everything I claimed to be fighting against. When I slapped you, I wasn't just attacking you. I was attacking everything you stand for. Marcus leaned forward slightly. It took courage to testify today. Courage would have been speaking up years ago, Jack replied, wiping his eyes. What I did today was just finally doing what's right. Marcus stood up slowly. Sometimes doing what's right is the hardest thing we can do. He paused, studying Jack's face. I'm not ready to forgive you, Jack. But I recognize that you've taken the first step toward real change. The weight of those words hung in the air between them, marking a subtle shift in their relationship. Not friendship, not yet forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Marcus Williams stood at his bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. The weight of the upcoming trial against Officer Paul Simmons pressed heavily on his shoulders. Behind him, Camille wrapped her arms around his waist, her presence steady and reassuring. I keep thinking about what this means for our community, Marcus said softly. If we fail to hold Simmons accountable, You've never backed down from doing what's right, Camille reminded him. That's why Jaden looks up to you so much. That's why you wear that robe. Marcus turned to face his wife, his eyes tired but determined. Sometimes I wonder if I'm asking too much of our family. We're stronger together, Camille said firmly, and you're showing our son what real courage looks like. In a quiet corner booth at the local diner, Jack Daniels sat across from Emily, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. The distance between them felt both physical and emotional. I have to testify, Jack said, his voice rough. Everything I've done, I need to make it right. Emily's eyes were wet with unshed tears. I'm proud that you're finally doing the right thing, Jack. But you have to understand, what you did, how you acted, it broke something in our family. I know, Jack whispered. I'm trying to fix it. Some things can't be fixed, Emily replied gently. But maybe they can be rebuilt. Differently. Better. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. In their high school classroom, Maggie Daniels and Jaden Williams stood side by side at the front, their presentation displayed on the whiteboard behind them. Their classmates watched with growing interest as they discussed the meaning of justice and integrity. My dad taught me that true strength isn't about power, Jaden explained, his voice clear and confident. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Maggie stepped forward. And I learned that admitting mistakes and trying to make things better takes real courage. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her head high. Their teacher, Mrs. Chen, wiped a tear from her eye as the students applauded. Around the room, faces that had once been divided by the controversy now showed understanding and respect. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest connections, Maggie concluded, sharing a smile with Jaden. Their classmates nodded, many of them seeing beyond the headlines to the human story underneath. Detective Clara Monroe spread photographs and documents across Marcus's desk in his chambers. Her hands trembled slightly with a mix of anger and disbelief as she revealed each piece of evidence. It goes deeper than we thought, Your Honor, she said, pointing to a series of bank statements. Officer Simmons was just the tip of the iceberg. We found systematic cover-ups dating back years. Marcus leaned forward, studying the documents. His jaw tightened as he saw familiar names, officers he'd seen in his courtroom, some he'd even trusted. How many are involved? At least 12 officers, Clara replied, including 2 lieutenants. She pulled out more files, showing surveillance photos of secret meetings and suspicious transactions. Marcus felt his stomach turn, but his resolve strengthened. This is exactly why we can't back down, Detective. Jack Daniels stood in the parking lot of his old precinct, watching former friends avoid his gaze as they hurried past. Officer Thompson, his partner of 3 years, finally stopped when Jack called out. Mike, please, you know what Simmons did was wrong, Jack said, his voice low and urgent. Thompson shifted uncomfortably. You're asking us to turn on our own, Jack. I'm asking you to stand up for what's right, Jack countered. You saw how things were run. Help me fix it. 2 other officers approached, Martinez and Chen. Martinez spoke first. I'll testify. What happened to Judge Williams? It wasn't right. Chen nodded in agreement, but others passing by shot them dirty looks. Traitors, someone muttered loudly enough to hear. In the Williams family living room, Marcus sat with Camille and Jaden. The evening light cast long shadows across their faces as Marcus explained the situation. The trial is going to be difficult, Marcus said carefully. These officers have friends, and they might try to intimidate us. Camille reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. We knew this wouldn't be easy. Dad, Jaden said, sitting up straighter. You taught me that doing what's right isn't about being safe. It's about being brave. His young face showed determination beyond his years. I'm not afraid to stand with you. Marcus felt pride and concern mix in his chest as he looked at his son. This fight could follow you at school, in the community. Then let it follow me, Jaden replied firmly. I'd rather be known as someone who stood up for justice than someone who stayed quiet because they were scared. Camille wiped a tear from her eye. We're in this together, Marcus. All of us. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and protesters as Marcus Williams made his way inside. Camera flashes lit up the morning air like lightning, and competing chants echoed off the building's stone facade. Some voices called for justice, others defended the police. Inside the packed courtroom, Prosecutor Ellen Garcia rose from her seat, her dark suit crisp and professional. Her voice carried clear and strong as she addressed the jury. "What you'll hear in this trial isn't just about one attack on one judge," she began. "This case reveals a pattern of misconduct orchestrated by Officer Paul Simmons, a man who betrayed his badge and the public trust." Garcia methodically laid out the evidence, pointing to surveillance footage, bank records, and witness statements. Officer Simmons didn't just arrange an attack on Judge Williams. He represents a culture of corruption that threatens the very foundation of justice in our community. The defense attorney, Richard Morton, stood next. His expensive suit and confident smirk presented a stark contrast to Garcia's earnest demeanor. "The prosecution would have you believe that Officer Simmons, a decorated police veteran, orchestrated some grand conspiracy," Morton said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But what they won't tell you is how Judge Williams has consistently shown bias against law enforcement. His rulings have repeatedly undermined police authority and public safety." Morton paced before the jury. "This case isn't about justice. It's about a judge with an agenda trying to dismantle our police force." When Marcus took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke with quiet dignity about the night of the attack, describing the masked figure who emerged from the shadows of the parking garage. His voice remained steady as he detailed the broader pattern of intimidation and threats. "This isn't about me," Marcus testified, looking directly at the jury. "This is about upholding the law equally for everyone. When officers like Mr. Simmons abuse their power, they don't just harm individuals, they damage the trust between police and the community they're sworn to protect." From his seat at the defense table, Simmons glared at Marcus, his face reddening with each word. Several uniformed officers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably as Marcus described finding evidence of systematic cover-ups and corruption. "I believe in our justice system," Marcus continued. "I believe in good police officers who serve with honor. That's precisely why we must hold accountable those who betray that trust." The gallery erupted in mixed reactions, some people nodding in agreement, others muttering in anger. The judge called for order, but the tension in the room remained palpable. Clara Monroe, sitting behind the prosecution table, watched the jury closely. Some appeared moved by Marcus's testimony, while others remained stoic. She knew this trial would test not just the evidence they'd gathered, but the community's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about those meant to protect them. Jack Daniels stepped into the witness box, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. A former police officer testifying against one of their own was unprecedented. "Officer Daniels," Prosecutor Garcia began, "please tell us about the culture within the department." Jack cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "We protected our own no matter what. If someone crossed the thin blue line," he paused, swallowing hard, "we made their lives difficult. I was part of that. I believed in it." His eyes found Marcus Williams in the gallery. "I let my pride and prejudice blind me. When I struck Judge Williams that day at the diner, I wasn't just attacking him. I was defending a system I knew was broken." Simmons's face darkened as Jack detailed specific instances of misconduct he'd witnessed. "Officer Simmons told us to target certain neighborhoods, certain people. If anyone complained, we closed ranks. We called it loyalty, but it was corruption." Marcus sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable as Jack continued his testimony. Detective Monroe noticed his hands gripping the bench tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "I'm sorry," Jack said, looking directly at Marcus. "I'm sorry for the assault, for the harassment, for everything I represented. Judge Williams showed me what real integrity looks like, and I failed that test badly." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, painting Jack as a traitor seeking leniency. But Jack remained steady, his voice growing stronger as he described the evidence linking Simmons to the attack on Marcus. After the testimony, Marcus stood in the courthouse hallway when Jack approached him. The tension between them was electric, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "I meant what I said in there," Jack said quietly. Marcus studied him for a long moment. "Words are easy, Mr. Daniels. Real change takes time and sustained effort." "I know," Jack nodded. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know I understand now what you've been fighting for." "Understanding is a start," Marcus replied. "But it's only that, a start." He turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you for telling the truth today. That took courage." The two men shared a brief look of acknowledgement before going their separate ways, both knowing that while something had shifted between them, the road to true redemption would be long and challenging. Detective Clara Monroe approached the evidence table with measured steps, holding a small digital recorder. The courtroom fell silent as she took the stand. "This recording was recovered during the authorized search of Officer Simmons's residence," she explained, her voice clear and professional. "It contains a conversation between Officer Simmons and another officer discussing Judge Williams. As the recording played, Simmons's threatening voice filled the courtroom. Williams needs to learn his place. If the attack didn't teach him, maybe something worse will." The words hung heavy in the air, causing Marcus's family to draw closer together. The defense attorney slumped slightly, knowing the impact of this final piece of evidence. Simmons's face had gone pale, his facade of confidence crumbling. While the jury deliberated, the courthouse hallway buzzed with tension. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat between Camille and Jaden, their hands linked in a chain of support. Camille squeezed his hand periodically, offering silent strength. Across the room, Jack Daniels sat alone on a wooden bench, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He watched the Williams family, seeing in their unity everything he had nearly lost through his own actions. His eyes occasionally met Marcus's, and both men shared brief nods of understanding. Minutes stretched into hours. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the high windows when the bailiff finally announced the jury's return. Everyone filed back into their seats, the air thick with anticipation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury forewoman stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant, Paul Simmons, guilty. On the charge of orchestrating an attack on a federal judge, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Some spectators jumped to their feet cheering, while others stormed out in protest. Simmons stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief as officers moved to take him into custody. Marcus released a long breath, years of tension leaving his body. Camille wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. Jaden beamed with pride at his father. Detective Monroe and Prosecutor Garcia exchanged satisfied looks, knowing their meticulous work had finally paid off. Through the commotion, Marcus remained seated, exhaustion evident in his features but relief clear in his eyes. He understood that while this battle was won, the larger fight for justice would continue. But for now, in this moment, truth had prevailed. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filled every seat. Colorful banners celebrating justice and unity decorated the walls. Marcus Williams sat in the front row beside Camille, his hands folded in his lap, looking humble despite being the guest of honor. Jaden Williams approached the podium, adjusting the microphone with slightly trembling hands. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "My father taught me that doing what's right isn't always easy. When people threatened him, when they tried to intimidate our family, he never backed down. But more importantly, he showed me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about making things better for everyone." Tears glistened in Marcus's eyes as his son continued. "Dad, you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for every person who needed someone to stand up for them. Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like." The audience rose in a standing ovation, and Marcus embraced his son tightly as he returned to his seat. A few days later, Jack Daniels reported for his first day of community service at the newly established Police Reform Initiative. He found Marcus waiting for him in a small office filled with morning sunlight. "I appreciate you agreeing to supervise this," Jack said, his voice carrying notes of both shame and hope. Marcus gestured for him to sit. "This program isn't about punishment, Jack. It's about transformation. We both know the system needs to change." "I spent so many years being part of the problem," Jack admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "I didn't want to see it. And now? Now I want to help fix what I helped break." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "I owe that to my daughter, to everyone I failed." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's a good place to start." Later that afternoon, Maggie and Jaden walked home from school together, their backpacks swinging in rhythm with their steps. The spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers. "Did you see my dad actually smiled yesterday?" Maggie said, kicking a small stone along the sidewalk. "Like a real smile. I haven't seen that in forever." Jaden grinned. "Maybe because my mom invited your family over for dinner this weekend?" "Who would have thought?" Maggie laughed, shaking her head. "A few months ago, our dads couldn't even be in the same room." "People can change," Jaden said, "when they choose to." They both burst out laughing when a squirrel darted between them, nearly causing Maggie to trip. Their laughter echoed down the street, bright and hopeful, like the sound of healing itself. Marcus Williams sat across from Mayor Thompson in the well-appointed office, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The polished desk between them seemed to symbolize the growing divide in their perspectives. "We need comprehensive reform," Marcus said, spreading out the detailed proposal he'd prepared. "The Simmons case proved this isn't about a few bad officers. The entire system needs restructuring." The mayor leaned back, adjusting his tie. "Marcus, you know I support you, but we have to be realistic. The police union is pushing back hard. Small steps might be more achievable." "Small steps won't prevent another Simmons," Marcus replied, his voice firm but measured. "We need oversight committees, better training programs, community involvement, all of which cost money and political capital," the mayor interrupted, spreading his hands. "Give me something I can work with. Something less dramatic." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "With respect, sir, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us here." Across town at the youth center, Jack Daniels walked through the doors, his heart pounding. The familiar face of Ryan Jefferson stopped him in his tracks. Ryan stood frozen, his expression guarded. "I didn't know you'd be here," Jack said softly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I want to apologize for what happened at the diner. I was wrong, plain and simple." Ryan crossed his arms, studying Jack's face. "That's it? Just sorry?" "No," Jack shook his head. "I've spent months thinking about how I treated you, about all the times I might have treated others the same way. I was angry, scared of losing control, but that's no excuse. I hurt you, and I'm truly sorry." Ryan's shoulders relaxed slightly. Takes guts to admit that. Meanwhile, in the school library, Maggie and Jaden huddled over a laptop, planning their community forum. "We could invite speakers from different backgrounds," Maggie suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Police officers, community leaders, young people." Jaden nodded, adding notes to their outline. "Maybe we could break into small groups too. It's easier for people to open up that way." "Just like our dads," Maggie said, smiling. "They had to learn to listen to each other too." "Yeah," Jaden agreed. "If they can do it, maybe others can too." A gentle knock on Marcus Williams's office door broke his concentration from the stack of papers before him. When he called out, "Come in," he was surprised to see Jack Daniels step through, clutching a thick manila envelope. "Judge Williams," Jack said, his voice steadier than Marcus remembered. "I have something you need to see." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, studying the former officer's face. Jack seemed different. The angry edge was gone, replaced by something that looked like determination mixed with regret. Jack placed the envelope on the desk. "These are records I've been collecting. Names, dates, incidents that were covered up. Things that should have been reported but weren't." His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. "Some of these officers are still on the force, some have been promoted." Marcus leafed through the documents, his eyes widening. This is extensive, Jack. You understand what providing this means? I do, Jack nodded. I've been part of the problem for so long. It's time I helped fix it. Across town, Detective Clara Monroe sat at her desk, surrounded by the evidence Jack had provided. Each document led to another connection, another thread in a web of corruption that made her stomach turn. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's number. Judge Williams, she said, her voice tight with urgency. This goes way beyond Simmons. We're looking at a coordinated effort to hide misconduct. Deputy Chief Rogers is implicated. So is Commissioner Bennett. She spread out a timeline she'd constructed. These cover-ups span the last decade. False reports, tampered evidence, witnesses pressured into silence. It's systematic. Marcus's sharp intake of breath carried through the phone. How high does this go? All the way to the top, Clara replied. And there's more. Some of these cases intersect with major political figures. This could shake the whole city. In a quiet corner of the local coffee shop, Camille Williams stirred her latte, watching Emily Daniels across the table. The awkward silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Thank you for meeting me, Emily finally said, her fingers wrapped tightly around her cup. I know this can't be easy. Camille smiled softly. It's not easy for any of us, but I've seen the changes in Jack, the way he's trying to make things right. He's different now. Emily nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. When he first started changing, I wasn't sure if it would last, but watching him face his mistakes, stand up to his former colleagues, it took real courage. It did, Camille agreed. And so did you staying with him through it all, supporting him while he found his way back to who he should be. Emily wiped her eyes. I almost left, you know, but I saw something in him, a glimmer of the man I married, fighting to come back. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves, Camille said, reaching across the table to squeeze Emily's hand. Jack won his. That's worth something. The two women sat in companionable silence, the tension between them slowly dissolving like sugar in their coffee. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, marking the end of another day in their changing world. The evening news broadcast cut to breaking news, interrupting regular programming. The anchor's face was grave as she announced, Breaking tonight, a massive police corruption scandal rocks our city. Detective Clara Monroe's year-long investigation has uncovered systematic misconduct at the highest levels of law enforcement. The story exploded across screens citywide. Documents, testimonies, and evidence painted a damning picture of corruption that reached the police commissioner's office. Detective Monroe's meticulous investigation, supported by Jack Daniels' insider knowledge, had exposed decades of cover-ups, falsified reports, and witness intimidation. Marcus Williams watched the coverage from his office, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters and city officials. When the mayor's office called, requesting his leadership of a new police reform task force, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Judge Williams, the mayor said, her voice tense, we need someone with your integrity and experience to lead this. The public trusts you. They know you fought for justice even when it cost you personally. Marcus thought of all the moments that had led to this, the diner incident, the attack, the trial. I'll do it, he said firmly. But I want complete autonomy to implement real change. Across town, Jack Daniels stood before a packed community center. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but his voice was steady as he began sharing his story. I was wrong, he said, looking out at the sea of faces. For years, I was part of the problem. I let my pride and prejudice blind me to the harm I was causing. His voice cracked with emotion. But standing here today, I want to tell you about my journey from being part of the problem to working toward the solution. Officers in the audience shifted uncomfortably as Jack described his transformation. He spoke about the moment he slapped Marcus Williams, about his spiral into anger and denial, and about his eventual awakening to the truth. As he spoke, several officers nodded in recognition of their own biases. We can't change the past, Jack continued, but we can choose to be better today than we were yesterday. It starts with admitting our mistakes and committing to real change. At the local high school auditorium, Jaden Williams and Maggie Daniels had transformed the space into a community forum. People from all walks of life filled the seats: police officers, community activists, teachers, business owners, and families. "Welcome," Jaden said into the microphone, his voice clear and confident. "We're here today because we believe in the power of listening to each other's stories." Maggie stepped forward, adding, "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about understanding each other and finding a way forward together." One by one, community members approached the microphone. A grandmother shared her fears for her grandsons. A rookie police officer admitted his struggles with institutional pressure. A teacher described the impact of systemic bias on her students. The atmosphere in the room shifted as stories were shared. Tears flowed freely, and strangers reached out to comfort one another. When Ryan Jefferson took the stage to share his experience from the diner incident, Jack Daniels, sitting in the audience, listened with visible emotion. Marcus Williams, watching from the back of the auditorium with Camille, felt a surge of pride seeing his son and Maggie facilitating such meaningful dialogue. The forum had become more than just a school project. It was a catalyst for real change in their community. The evening ended with people exchanging contact information, making plans for future meetings, and forming new connections across previously rigid divides. The walls that had separated their community for so long were beginning to crumble, one conversation at a time. Marcus Williams stood before the newly assembled Police Reform Task Force in City Hall's main conference room. The tension was palpable as he faced the mix of community leaders, officers, and city officials. Several high-ranking police administrators sat with crossed arms, their displeasure evident in their rigid postures. "I stand before you today not just as a judge," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, "but as someone who has experienced firsthand the consequences of unchecked power." He touched the faded scar on his temple from the parking garage attack. "Our system isn't broken because of a few bad actors. It's broken because we've allowed fear and silence to govern our actions." As murmurs of disagreement rose from some corners, Marcus raised his hand. "I was attacked for upholding justice. My family was threatened. But what truly threatened our community wasn't violence. It was the culture of silence that protected wrongdoing." His words seemed to touch something in the room. Even some of the resistant officials began to uncross their arms. Across town, Jack Daniels walked into his old precinct, his heart pounding but his steps determined. Captain Richard Hayes sat behind his desk, looking up with surprise as Jack entered. "Daniels, you've got some nerve showing up here?" Hayes sneered. "I know everything, Rich," Jack said, his voice tight with emotion. "The evidence tampering, the witness intimidation, the kickbacks." He pulled out his phone, playing a recording of Hayes discussing payoffs with Simmons. Hayes' face drained of color. "You're wearing a wire right now, aren't you?" "Detective Monroe," Jack called out, and Clara emerged from around the corner with 2 internal affairs officers. "Captain Hayes, you're under arrest." As Hayes was led away in handcuffs, other officers watched in shocked silence. Jack felt a mixture of sadness and relief, remembering all the times he'd looked up to Hayes, never suspecting the corruption that lay beneath. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his chambers when Jack knocked on the door. The 2 men regarded each other carefully, years of history hanging between them. "That was brave what you did today," Marcus said, gesturing for Jack to sit. "I learned about courage from watching you," Jack replied, his voice humble. "I can never undo what I did to you, but I want to help make real change happen." Marcus studied Jack for a moment, then reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a proposal for community police partnerships. "I could use someone who knows the department from the inside," he said, sliding the document across the desk. "Someone who understands both sides of this divide." Jack picked up the proposal, emotion flickering across his face. "You're trusting me with this?" "Trust is earned," Marcus replied, "and you've earned it." The 2 men shook hands, their grip firm and genuine, marking a new chapter in their relationship and in the city's journey toward justice. Jack Daniels stood at the front of the Police Academy auditorium, his hands steady as he arranged his presentation materials. The room buzzed with conversation as officers from precincts across the city filed in. Marcus Williams sat in the back, watching with quiet approval as Jack prepared to launch their joint initiative. "I used to think being a good cop meant being tough," Jack began, his voice carrying across the room. "But I learned the hard way that true strength comes from understanding." He clicked through slides showing community engagement scenarios, each one designed to challenge ingrained biases. Marcus stepped forward to join him, and together they introduced role-playing exercises that paired officers with community members. The sight of the judge and former officer working in tandem drew curious looks from the audience. At the Williams household that evening, the smell of Camille's signature pot roast filled the air. She hummed softly while setting the table, placing her best china with care. Marcus sat in his favorite armchair, watching Jaden arrange fresh flowers in a vase. "You know, Dad," Jaden said, adjusting a stem, "when all this started, I was so angry. I wanted you to fight back differently." Marcus smiled warmly. "And now? Now I see that standing firm for what's right, even when it's hard. That's the real fight." Jaden's eyes shone with pride. Camille wiped her hands on her apron and joined them. "We've all grown stronger," she said, squeezing Marcus's shoulder. "As a family, and as people." Later that week at the community center, Jack stood before a packed audience. His voice wavered slightly as he introduced his surprise guest. "Many of you know how my journey started, with an incident at a diner involving a young man named Ryan Jefferson." Jack gestured to the side of the stage. "Ryan, would you please join me?" Ryan Jefferson walked onto the stage, his steps measured and dignified. The audience fell silent, remembering the viral video that had started everything. "When Officer Daniels first approached me that day," Ryan began, his voice clear and strong, "I was just another target to him. But standing here today, I see a changed man." He turned to face Jack. "Your actions hurt me, but your transformation has helped heal our community. I forgive you." Tears streamed down Jack's face as Ryan extended his hand. The audience rose to their feet, many wiping their eyes as the two men embraced, their reconciliation embodying hope for the entire city. The autumn sun cast a warm glow over the gathered crowd as Marcus Williams stood before the gleaming new community center. Beside him, Jack Daniels shifted nervously, adjusting his tie. Their families sat in the front row, Camille and Emily sharing knowing looks while Jaden and Maggie beamed with pride. "The Williams Daniels Community Center," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the expectant audience, "represents more than just a building. It represents the power of transformation, understanding, and unity." Jack stepped forward to help Marcus cut the ceremonial ribbon. Camera flashes captured the moment. Two men who had started as adversaries now standing shoulder to shoulder. The crowd erupted in applause as the red ribbon fluttered to the ground. Inside the bustling center, Jaden and Maggie led tours through the various program rooms. They stopped at their pride and joy, the Youth Outreach Classroom. "This is where we teach conflict resolution," Maggie explained to a group of visitors, gesturing to the colorful posters and interactive displays. Jaden added, "We want kids to understand that justice isn't about punishment. It's about healing and growth." His words drew approving nods from the parents in the group. The two teenagers had developed their own curriculum, combining their unique perspectives as children of a judge and a police officer. Their program already had a waiting list of eager participants. Marcus and Jack walked through the center's corridors, observing the life and energy filling every corner. Children played in supervised areas while teens participated in workshops. Community leaders met in conference rooms planning future initiatives. They paused before a striking mural that covered an entire wall. The artwork told their story in vibrant colors, from the tense courtroom scenes to the moments of reconciliation. At the center, two hands clasped in unity beneath the words "Justice for All." "Look at all this," Jack said softly, watching a group of young police cadets engage in a trust-building exercise with local youth. Marcus turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about where we started, it's about where we go from here." Above them, the mural seemed to glow in the afternoon light, a testament to their journey and a beacon for the future. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Marcus and Officer Paul, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.